But again, in order to best help us identify within the context of covenant what faith means, again, more like trust or loyalty, an emphasis on the loyalty part. Because again, what we see with Abram it will be contrasted with what we find in Genesis 3 through 11. Where one of the key things that we saw in Genesis 3 through 11 that was repeated, and we talked about it last class, and there was a word that I had brought up that becomes a problem, especially in what we find with the flood, and then again with Babel. What was the word that I had brought up? This idea, and it's not just sin. It was a very specific.
Autonomy.
There you go, autonomy. And so again, in the face of autonomy, this kind of self-rule that humans declare for themselves, that there's somebody who does something different. But again, the faith or the confidence, the loyalty that is exhibited, and the obedience that is exhibited by Abram. Again, in the face of stories of autonomous creatures dubbing for themselves what is good and what is evil, and that may be on a quiz coming up, of what happens in Genesis 3. This desire, this temptation to be like God in knowing good and evil for themselves. Again, making these autonomous calls for themselves. And so before talking about these next kind of 2 points, I do want to bring up what's going on here in the passage. That now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And what does Abram go ahead and do? He gets up and he goes. Just that easy. You have this deity who just shows up to Abram and he goes. But with this first covenant, kind of initial proto covenant, that what we have is kind of physical location with the offering of future nationhood. And I can't go by that too quickly or make it too technical, because what you have here, that go from your country, your people, your kindred, kind of your community, and your father's house. Take off. Essentially, what God is asking or commanding to Abram is for Abram to leave behind his inheritance, all that he would have to live on, that would be able to sustain him and his family. God is telling him, take off. That again, what Abram is exhibiting here is a kind of confidence despite not having the full knowledge of what it all looks like, yet going. Again, in the face of what we've seen in the narratives from chapter 3 of Genesis all the way through 11, where these creatures who exhibit kind of autonomous self-rule, where they kind of just do what they want, and then the world ends up being more and more chaotic. The singular individual, the God says one thing and he does it. Again, not just as a automaton robot, but again, as a cooperative partner, Abram goes. And so you have that be a blessing as a result of that going. That in the way that we understand this, it's going to get teased out more later in other chapters. But that for us to understand here, that it's the way that Abram and his people were going to be a blessing is through obedience. And I can't underscore that enough. That the way Abram and his descendants were going to be a blessing was through obedience. Through obedience. And we'll get there especially when we talk about Exodus. And so those kind of consequences of blessing, that the first section, which focuses on a national blessing, that I will bless you, and then the rest of the families of the earth being blessed through Abraham. That again, that the blessing in the second part of international blessing comes from the first, which is again, the first part of being obedient, which translates into a kind of effect on the whole world. And this this does shape the way we conceive both in terms of missions and how we go about our day-to-day lives, because again, this is much bigger than just working at a church and much bigger than just what we do on Sundays. That through our obedience that the world is affected in a way that isn't made possible through disobedience or just kind of doing whatever we want. And that through partnership, through our obedience, through partnership with what God is doing, that's the way that the earth is in what we might call blessed, or comes to know God's salvation. And so again, it's much more than just having faith and doing the right things and going to a foreign country, but rather again that the simple trust that is on display through obedience that becomes the ways in which we the world outside of God's people comes to know who the God of Israel is. And again, this will come up again in Exodus when we get there. This will come up again in Exodus. And so Genesis 15. That after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue. Literally it says, one from your loins shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and it was reckoned or counted to him as righteousness. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nations that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Then when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And so what we have here, again, in this second part of the covenant made to Abram, this kind of introduction by sacrificial ritual, that you have God and Abraham having a conversation, and the first thing Abram does is ask God a question about how this is going to happen. And notice that God doesn't necessarily tell Abram, You fool, why don't you just believe me and kind of go ahead and get along. The first time we just saw Abram just go, leaves his house, doesn't ask any questions. Second time around, Abram's got questions because he understands that there is something going on with his situation that is not particularly conducive to bringing in children, specifically his old body and his wife's barrenness. But it's through this question that a conversation then proceeds where God makes a promise to Abram that is prompted again by this question that Abram has, is how am I going to know? All I've got is this nephew who's a knucklehead and he's going to get everything. So good luck. So then again, this kind of ritual that happens, that I don't want to go by this too quickly, that Abram goes to sleep. And again, this calls to a different event back in Genesis. Who else is put to sleep in Genesis?
Adam.
Hmm?
Adam.
Hey, there you go. Again, so we have some continuity between the two. A deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in the land. So again, giving him a little bit of foreshadowing there. That in the verse 17, that when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. This is what we call a theophany. A theophany. Theophany. I'll go ahead and throw this in the chat so you guys can see. And what this is either a divine manifestation or what we would call an appearance of the divine. And so God shows up again with these two kind of symbols to represent his presence there. And what happens is he passes between the pieces of the animals that are there on the ground. And what you would have is these kind of two, say if my hands are the two animals, the two animals that are side by side, an individual would walk in between those two pieces, signifying that whatever happens to these animals, may it happen to the person who breaks this covenant. And so essentially, the promise God is making to Abraham, again, the promises God is making to Abraham is unilateral. Unilateral. And that it's God making the promise to Abram or Abraham with no particular premise. No particular premise that Abram, because you've done this, I'm going to do this. Or hey, make sure you do this and then I'll do my part. That no, that what God does is he unilaterally from his side, from his vantage point, makes a promise to Abraham to not, so first of all, give him descendants, and then to make available to them a land, give to them a land. And again, especially for a wandering nomadic people, land becomes very, very important for your animals, for your livestock, for your livelihoods. That if you're living in an agrarian of a farming culture, that to live on a good land is of utmost importance because you need it to live. You need land to produce. You need a place for your goats to graze, for your sheep to wander around. And so, again, the things that are being promised to Abraham, that God says that as these animals are chopped up, may it happen to me if I do not do what I say I'm going to do with giving you descendants and giving you a place for them to have. And so we add a third layer to the Abraham to this covenant. That when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And we'll talk about that phrase because it sounds like yeah, don't look at things you're not supposed to. Don't listen to rap music. Don't watch bad movies. No, that's not what it is. It's something else going on. And I will make a covenant, verse 2, and I will make my covenant between me and you and will make you exceedingly numerous. Then Abram fell on his face and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, exalted father, but your name shall be Abraham, father of many nations or father of a multitude of people. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And do notice the parts that I italicized and underlined this I will make, I will make, I will make. Of how God is so much the initiator of covenant and of relating to Abraham. And I will establish, I already said that part. Yeah. Okay, good. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. It's a covenant lasting forever, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God. God said to Abram, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and your offspring after you, and every male among you shall be circumcised. Snip, snip. And those of you that have taken BLE, you'll know the importance of circumcision in not just Hebrew culture, but in Hebrew understanding and Jewish identity. That this is part of the markers by which they understand both themselves and their covenant with God. It's the way that they've been marked by God into this, again, everlasting, perpetual, forever kind of covenant. That this mark, which endures for the lifetime, is one that remembers and recalls God's covenant to his people. And so again, you see the repetition of that I will, I will, I will. And it's these I wills that kind of put one last bow on the covenants which we've seen in 12, 15, and 17. So when we think Abrahamic covenant, we have to think Genesis 12, 15, and 17. Because again, these kind of moves that start building reach their crescendo, reach their high point here in chapter 17, that you have again these in this international significance where Abraham is going to be the father of many nations or multitude of nations. You have this name change, which signifies a change not just of character but also of destiny. Also of destiny, that Abraham wasn't just going to be a dad but rather the father of many or multitudes of nations. And I had talked about it before where I was going to talk about that walk before me and be blameless. And what it is, it's that it's the demand for absolute loyalty to a king. That it's a phrase that appears in other literature and it appears here in Genesis where Yahweh is prompting and calling forth for Abraham's, again, loyalty because he's about to initiate a covenant. And so again, in the context of covenant, that if we don't know that this is again ancient Near Eastern literature in the context of covenant, this walk before me and being blameless, this this that can just end up getting hijacked to, hey, make sure you get your life right, because and if you don't, if you mess it up, then I can't do anything with you. But again, if we understand it as loyalty, then it's a much more faithful rendering and reading of the text, not just in terms of how we understand it, but then also understanding the expectations that God has for individuals that he's working alongside. Again, it's not for perfection, but loyalty. Because as we see with Abraham, and as you guys read, Abraham, he doesn't always get everything right. That he lies to save the life of his wife, which is noble, but still lies a couple times because it happens twice. He manages to get himself in that. And so again, the expectation for perfection, which isn't necessarily assumed in the text, it's more like loyalty. And so this kind of covenant obligation that Abraham will continue to keep covenant with God as kind of the prerequisite for the establishment of the covenant. That is, again, that the loyalty which is expected, even though it's not drawn out as much as is in Exodus, but the loyalty that's expected at the start of the covenant. And the last, that I will be their God. That you have pagan gods who are identified with a place, and you'll know this again from your cultures class. We have again Ra, god of the sun, Osiris, god of the dead. You have certain locations, and even within outside of Egypt, that you have like Baal, who's god of the Canaanites. You have Molech, who's god, I believe, of the Amorites. Ashtoreth, which she's the god of the Philistines, Philistia. So again, you have these local deities that reside in certain places. But you have here a God who ties himself to a particular people, not to a particular place. You have God who identifies himself with a particular people, not to a particular place. So he becomes known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'll have in different places the God of Jacob or the God of Israel, not the location, but rather the people. And so again, God doesn't tie himself down to a specific location, but rather to a specific people. And this is true in the New Testament as well. And so again, to be able to identify some of the difference here for us, to be able to understand, especially as this thing gets bigger and bigger and the family starts growing, especially when they get down to Egypt, that we understand that in as much as the people travel, so does God. That God doesn't just stand aloof, but that rather God going with the people as they're journeying, as they're traveling, and as they're going about from one land to another, but that God goes with them. And so the presence of God, again, being confined not just to a place, but to a people, which comes up a lot in the New Testament, specifically in Acts 7 with Stephen's speech. And so, this isn't for that, but it's important to recognize here at the start that this isn't necessarily a novel idea about the way God binds himself to a people.
I got a
And so,
question.
go ahead.
So did surrounding nations, like, because you say that he's not confined to like a place, but he's confined to a people. So with other people groups, like, you know, the in the surrounding areas, like, did they by that then do they believe that their like gods are just the god of like their region, and but if they get outside of the parameters of that region, then they're not under his authority, or what?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does make sense, but I'd have to look more into that, because I do know that there is a lot of deities that are adopted. Like it's possible to have multiple deities, kind of like a pantheon. So the Romans were like that a lot. And I know it's a little bit later, but it wasn't a weird concept to have. Hey, I'm going to a new place. They have new deities, so I adopt those. Which is why you kind of have the phrase from Ruth that your God will be my God and your people will be my people. That I will take on whatever deity that belongs to you in the land that you're going to. And so there is a possibility for adopting, if you want to put it that way, adopting different deities and adding them to the collection. Um, because again, the spirituality that they exhibit, that there could be multiple gods and there's a hierarchy, and we talked about that last class again, and that's why it's really important that we understand the context, because how is it that Abram automatically kind of knows what to do in uh making an altar, making a sacrifice? Then when God walks through these pieces, Abram knows what is being communicated to him. And especially when we get to Genesis 22, that what's happening there, it's because again, familiarity with different deities and the concepts that are already there in existence. But as far as it goes with like, hey, do people ever leave the presence of a deity? I I need to look more into that, but I do know that it wasn't uncommon for people to adopt another deity on the entrance of a new land, or especially when they're conquered by a new people. So yeah, so again, I'll look more into that to see more specifics, but I know for certain that with again the conquering of new people, that yeah, they would adopt their gods. So, all right, are there any other questions, comments? All right. So with Abrahamic covenant, there are three things that are being promised, and so you have the promise of people, the promise of place, and the promise of presence. The promise of people, the promise of place, and the promise of presence. And this may or may not appear in a quiz. So just a heads up. That with the Abrahamic covenant, again, this promise of descendants, the promise of a place, this land that I will show you, which we then come to find out it's the land of Canaan. And then the promise of presence, that I will be your God and they will be my people. And we've talked about it in Biblit, but again, to kind of rehash this, because it's so important for not only our understanding of Israel, but then the way this starts to get teased out in the context of Exodus, Numbers, and especially Deuteronomy, and even beyond that when they actually enter into the promised land. That these promises become foundational for the way Israel understands herself and also understands God, who makes these promises to them. That you have God, again, who is known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that recalls this specific covenant made to Abraham. Again, the promise of people, promise of place, the promise of his presence being with them, descendants, the land of Canaan, and again, this kind of covenant relationship between God and this specific group of people. What this also reflects is how God brings Abraham and his descendants under his household and into his care. again, I had mentioned at the start of lecture that it's the patriarch who assumes responsibility for the household. Patriarch assumes responsibility for the household, and it's God who's taken the responsibility on himself to provide a place, provide a people, and to be with Abraham and his descendants, thus bringing them into his house and providing the care necessary in order for them to flourish. And again, this is really important for us to understand, especially as we get outside of the Pentateuch, um, that a patriarch's honor rose or fell on the capacity for the patriarch to be able to care for his own household. Let me say that again. That a patriarch's honor rose or fell on his capacity to be able to care for his own household, to maintain his own household. So when you see the people of Israel falling apart, what do you think that does later on? Again, to God's honor, God's notoriety. And so again, so that's what makes it really important starting out here to understand household and patriarchy. And then especially when we get to Exodus 32, um, we'll talk about more of this. But again, the way that these kind of elements are reflected in the text, that if we read through too quickly, or if we kind of brush off some of these details, then we're going to miss what the text is trying to get at with why these covenants keep repeating, what sense is it trying to make, and how is it connected to Genesis, the first parts of Genesis 1 through 11. Because again, God working in cooperation with singularly picking an individual, and then that individual then becomes a kind of catalyst for salvation or blessing in the world. All right, so we've got a few minutes here. What I want you guys to do, before we jump into Isaac and Jacob, what I do want you guys to do is get into groups. And what you'll be doing, given what we already know about Genesis 12 through 17 with Abraham, read through the following texts and describe those connections. So for Isaac, you'll read through Genesis 26, and then for Jacob, Genesis 35. And again, pay attention to certain phrases and certain promises that have already come up. And again, keep these ideas of the three P's: place, people, place, and presence. As you're reading through these texts, to take note of how is Genesis being tied together in certain elements that we're seeing with covenant, and what are the elements that are there that help for us as readers to make these connections across these chapters. And so I'll go ahead and repost the question into the announcement section for you guys, so you guys can have that with you guys if you don't remember, or if you don't have Moodle open or the presentation open. So again, if you don't have your cameras on, just turn your mic on and just let your group members know that, hey, I'm here. Don't be weird. Okay, so let's go ahead and open this up. Okay. Okay. All right. Again, I'll give you guys about 6 minutes, and don't